Hi, I'm Linda Kaucher. I've been looking at international trade agreements for quite a few years, working to inform the public about what's dangerous in them and working to oppose them. Trade agreements are not being mentioned by the parties in the election, really, and certainly not the dangers of trade agreements. There's two important aspects that receive very little attention in this country and not well defined, and that's the UK's own unilateral liberalisation and also labour issues are not mentioned very much. The UK has been completely liberalised since Thatcher's time, and that means that we have been completely open. All investment opportunities here have been completely open to transnational investors, whether it's private sector, like firms being sold off. It's always open to transnational investors, and the result of that is that we don't own anything anymore in this country because it's been in that direction for a long time. And it also applies when there are privatisations in the public sector. Those investment opportunities are also open to transnational investors. So this complete liberalisation is to suit the needs of the City of London because the transnational financial services there, we have to be the global model for liberalisation because that's what they want globally. So that's what drives UK policy. There's little attention paid to workers and to labour as an aspect of the economy, really. And if you notice, there's less and less reporting on workers as the shift in reporting has gone towards business perspectives and business needs. Tom Mills, in his book on the BBC, really points this out, how there are no industrial reporters anymore. It's all business focus. But work is really central to our lives. It's central to how we spend our time, much of our lives in time. It's also central to our survival. And labour's also the fundamental part of the economy. The left pays insufficient attention to this, but the right, as in big business, certainly knows the importance of driving down labour standards. And obviously this happens through two main mechanisms, is to shift work overseas to cheaper labour areas, or to bring in or move across borders workers who will work more cheaply, and that's inherently undermines labour standards as well. Both of these are reinforced in trade agreements and facilitated in international trade agreements. So what we're looking at going forward with UK trade agreements, the UK will be in the trade agreements that the EU is hurriedly pushing forward at this stage for quite a few years. We'll be tied into those for quite a few years. And then we're looking at the Brexit deals that are being suggested or pursued. So obviously a main priority for the UK government is a trade agreement with the US. And the person who has been and probably will continue to be in charge as Secretary of State for International Trade is Liam Fox, who's very closely aligned with US big business. In fact, has been an organisation that has been a bridge for a major US lobbying organisation. So very, very tied to the US corporations. And obviously the UK is very keen to push ahead with a deal with the US. We can look at what went on with the trade and investment partnership with the EU that has been negotiated for a few years but is at a standstill now. And we can see there that the biggest force was US agribusiness, pushing to get their lower standard food into the EU. And you can see that the UK is quite a GM-friendly government, and that the UK can be the opening for that, for US agribusiness pushing into the UK and as a doorway to the rest of Europe. Liam Fox has already said that the needs of the banking industry and financial services will be prioritised in a US-UK trade agreement if it was to happen. So you can see that the needs of the public and so for instance on food standards will be not prioritised at all. It will be traded off for the needs of banking. Another strong suggestion and a push forward is to have a UK-India free trade agreement. And there again we can see the previous model of what was negotiated in an EU-India free trade agreement. The main priority for India is always to be pushing out supplying cheap labour into other countries, and that will be the priority. In a UK-India free trade agreement, it will be cheap labour from India will be the Indian priority in an agreement like that. In trade terms, this is called Mode 4. It's part of services, and Mode 4 has no numerical limits to it, has no quotas. You can't have an economic needs test to see whether you actually need workers from outside or not. All that is prohibited within the trade context. So an a UK-India free trade agreement would be a big opening to cheap labour from India, supplied by any Indian firm, and there's a lot of Indian firms. So this is something that workers here need to be aware of. There's another push, obviously, to have an agreement with China. The deal that the EU has been negotiating with China is a bilateral investment treaty. So it's only concerned with investment rather than the whole range of a free trade agreement. And the difference with a bilateral investment treaty is that things like human rights, labour conditions, or environment do not come into it at all. There are no demands in that regard. We need to be really watchful about what's being proposed for trade agreements and not accept this magic word that trade agreements are the one thing we need. It's the content of trade agreements that really matters, and we need to know that from the earliest stages, and we need the assessment of who's going to benefit and who's going to lose from such trade agreements. A good source of information about trade agreements generally, but in the EU context, is Corporate Europe Observatory, CEO. They've looked at a lot of aspects of the agreements that have been negotiated at the EU level. What we need in the UK is the same sort of strong network for information sharing that has been in place across the EU to fight the EU trade agreements. Now we need that sort of network here, sharing on with a focus on trade agreements.